Thank you all for joining me today. I really appreciate your interest in the topic. I'm going to start with a quick background about myself. So just give me a moment as I share my screen. Okay, I'm hoping you guys can see my screen. Okay, I think success. Excellent. I apologize for the delay. Losing power has certainly thrown me off a little. Excited to talk to you guys about GitOps and security in the era of GitOps specifically today. But before I do that, let me just jump in with a quick introduction. I run strategy and marketing at a startup called Accurix. We're in the cloud security space, and I've spent my career, couple of decades in the cybersecurity space. I started as a developer, went into product, and then most recently marketing. And my passion is really building companies. So this is my fourth cloud security startup, and that's what I'm most passionate about. I'm also a mother of two little girls, a 3 and a 6-year-old. So, you know, amongst all the fun things at work, there's always the fun on the home side. And, you know, some days I feel like I'm crushing it. And then there's other days where, you know, I go from coffee to a beer. But that's a different conversation. Let me get started on our topic today. So just to set the stage on this, as I mentioned, I've been in the cloud security space for a while. There's, you know, literally hundreds of tools in the cloud security ecosystem. And the question then becomes, how do you figure out which of these tools or which combination of tools make sense to secure your cloud environments? And so there's a lot of different tools. And today we're going to talk about a strategy in building out and seeing which tools, you know, make sense in which parts of the development lifecycle. So, but before I jump into that, let me just start by laying the foundations of why it matters. And so, as you guys all know very well, there are billions of users and devices that are connecting to the cloud every day. And this is across a variety of industries that I'm sure all of you guys are spread across. But I think the really frightening fact is the fact that this number is actually going to more than double in the next 4 years alone. And as we all know, the cloud isn't something that's static, continuously changing. And so there's literally millions of code commits by developers every single day in the cloud. And all it really takes is one bad commit to basically expose billions of records. And we've seen 30 billion records exposed in the last 3 years alone. And as some of you guys you know, that are following the space know very well, that it's going beyond just stealing data. We hear a lot about S3 buckets being breached, and you know, we're starting to hear about newer attacks such as the watering hole attacks in the cloud. And an example is where there was a company that had an open S3 bucket, but instead of stealing data from within the bucket, which there wasn't any, the attacker actually uploaded malicious code into their script, into their SDK. And then that SDK was then downloaded by the company's clients. And so in effect, poisoning the cloud supply chain. So we are starting to see more advanced attacks in the cloud as well. And so needless to say, it's now more important than ever to ensure that we build a more resilient architecture in the cloud. And so the question is, you know, how do we do that? But if you look at the current, you know, landscape of cloud security tools and how they're applied in the development lifecycle, they aren't really built for developers. So when you look at your typical DevOps lifecycle and you have your broad phases of code, commit, build, deploy, and run, you have a variety of tools that we use across the lifecycle. And the reality is a lot of these tools are basically focused on runtime. And that made sense when, you know, a majority of your infrastructure was deployed during runtime. So when you deploy your infrastructure and you push it to runtime, and then you have a variety of tools that are applied in runtime to look for threats. And one of those tools could be looking for misconfigurations, or a market that Gartner has called cloud security posture management. But however, as we hear about this trend towards shifting left and everything being as code, infrastructure is one of those things that's been codified. So now a lot of developers use infrastructure as code, such as Terraform, or CloudFormation templates, or even Kubernetes YAML files or manifests to define what their cloud infrastructure should be configured as during dev time itself. And so it doesn't make sense to do some of these security checks all the way at the end in runtime, because often it's a bit too late to actually make changes to the configurations at that time. So We hear a lot in the industry, there's a lot of talking about shifting security left, and I don't think that's a new concept, but I think we have to consider the extent to which security tools need to shift left. So for example, in the case of doing your infrastructure configuration checks on the left, that makes a lot of sense. But the problem with that is a lot of these tools that were built for runtime and that were really built for security teams aren't really developer friendly, in the sense that the output or the alerts that you get from some of these tools may not be something that developers know how to react to. So for example, there may be an alert about an port being open to the internet. Frankly, that may not mean a lot to developers, and even if they have the best intentions of fixing the issue, they may not have the know-how on how to do it. And so if I actually take that forward a step, this is the world of DevOps, where you have your distinct phases of ops as well as runtime. But we hear a lot today this notion of GitOps. And for those of you that aren't familiar with GitOps, for those of you that aren't that familiar with GitOps effectively is this notion where there is almost no ops. So what you have is developers aren't just writing application code or infrastructure as code, but they're also writing deployment as code, or what we call deployment as code, using tools such as Helm charts or Kustomize. And once they write the code, they simply commit the code to their repository, whether it's GitHub or Bitbucket, and the rest of the process is automated. So your app is automatically built and it is automatically deployed. So examples of build automation tools are Scaffold and Kaneko and Tecton, some very popular projects that have gained a lot of traction recently. And an example of a automatic deployment tool, if you will, is Flux and Argo and even Jenkins X. And so given this, the adoption of some of these tools, the entire process that you're seeing in the build, commit, build, deploy, run phases is automated. The only thing that actually physically happens is the developer committing code. So in this world, the question then becomes, where do you apply security? What happens to all those runtime security controls? Of course, we will never, we do need controls in runtime, but some of these other tools that used to be on the right have to also start shifting left. And so examples are, your DAS tools, right? Dynamic application security testing, or your IaaS tools, or even your, looking for your OSS vulnerability tools, right? All of that stuff also needs to shift left, which is fine, because now we have the opportunity to detect security risks earlier. The only issue with that is that, again, these tools aren't really built for developers. And so now we've got more tools generating more alerts, and they're not really connected to one another. So in effect, it creates a lot of noise for developers at the end of the day, and they just don't know how to make sense of it. So from my point of view, we really need to think about how do we take a developer-first approach to security, because at the end of the day, if we can curb our risk and reduce our attack surface from the get-go, that's a win-win for all of us. So if I kind of take a step back from what exists today and talk about how should we think about architecting a security structure that actually allows us to help developers help themselves. So I break it into 5 phases. The first phase is what I call developing secure cloud code from the get-go. So as developers are local infrastructure as code using Terraform or CloudFormation templates or Kubernetes files or even Helm charts locally on their development machine, we have to provide a mechanism to provide a way for them to write secure code from the get-go. And that in and of itself is a whole topic. But from my point of view, if we have secure artifacts that are built that developers can simply apply for here's an example of a secure of a security group that has been blessed by the company, and here is an example of of another component that has been pre-built for the developers. They can simply pick and choose and really quickly build a more secure architecture. right? So that is really step one, is secure cloud development, and in dev time as developers are writing their code. Once they commit to the repo, that's when it gets complicated, because now you've got to run your application security tests, you've got to run your OSS vulnerability tests, you've got to look for IAC, infrastructure misconfigurations. And so how do we make sense of that world for them? And so I believe that the right approach here is to actually have a capability or do threat modeling to consume the data from all of these different tools and build a threat model, which then tells the developer definitively that based on our threat modeling and using the data from all of these different tools, you have a breach path here. And I'll show you an example shortly of what that might look like. And once we tell them you have a breach path, that's only half the battle. So now they know they have a serious problem, but they still may not be in a position to be able to fix that breach path per se. So the second part of the equation is we not only tell them that they have a problem, but we have to help them understand how to programmatically fix this breach path. And so again, I'll show you an example of exactly what step 2 and 3 could look like. So steps 1, 2, and 3 cumulatively are really focused on ensuring that we reduce our attack surface from the get-go. And so that by the time the application gets into runtime, you've really dramatically reduced your risk. Now, as in any security architecture, you always want defense in depth. So we must assume that at some point in time, if there may be a risk that gets introduced even after the app is built securely. And this is, so you need some sort of governance to prevent known risks from entering known resources or resources with known risks from entering the architecture later in runtime. And so some sort of admission controller mechanism to govern policies and risk must be there at this stage. Now, once the application then gets to runtime, then that's your last layer of defense is basically saying, I have to have a mechanism to automatically detect and respond to risks. And so again, in this phase, I would say that we need to continue to do some threat modeling to be able to detect, are there any risks? And the threat modeling here is slightly different from what we talked about in step 2. It's really focused on saying, okay, I need to understand what resources I have in my environment, how are they configured, what are the relationships between these resources, and I need to consume event logs to understand what activities are happening. So once I have that threat model, that will tell me what is definitively a risk and what is not. And once I understand where the breach path is, I can then have a way to respond to it. But, since in this world of GitOps, everything is automated, there is no manual remediation of risk. So you then have to have a capability that programmatically generates the fix for you, whatever that is. And again, I have an example to show what this might look like. But assume that a code fix is generated to break the breach path. This is then submitted back to the repository, perhaps as a pull or merge request. And then based on these build automation tools, the app automatically rebuilds itself. So that is the world that I imagine with GitOps. Since everything is automatic and programmatic, security also must be programmatic. So these are the 5 pillars. I'm going to dive into steps 2, 3, and 5. So I want to show you what I believe would be the way to solve and the way to do threat modeling and detect breach paths. So starting with an example of a sample breach path, right? Here is a classic breach path, very familiar one, close to the Capital One breach path that we saw a few years ago. But in this breach, there was a app vulnerability. In this case, it's an SSR vulnerability, which was tied to a misconfigured WAF, which was tied to an overly permissive IAM role, which was tied to a database that was unencrypted. So it took a series of these different things to daisy chain together to create this breach path. Now, when you think about it, your SAST tool will tell you that you have this app vulnerability, the SSR app. But what the SAST tool generally doesn't have any idea about is the infrastructure upon which this app is running. So it doesn't know if the app is behind a WAF or not. And so You could then use an infrastructure scanning tool to look for infrastructure misconfigurations, which these last three things are. But again, the infrastructure as code scanning tool can't quite tell you whether there's a vulnerability in the app. So the point here is neither tool on its own actually has full visibility into this breach path. But if you were to combine the data sets and the alerts from both tools to build a threat model, you could, perceivably find this breach path. And so from a developer point of view, though, it might look something like this. So imagine you've got a developer that is coding away and in GitHub as their repo of choice. And in GitHub, you've got the ability to run a bunch of actions. And in this case, we're going to run some scans. So the first scan we're going to run is a SAS scan, a static analysis scan. And that tool will give you a bunch of results of all the issues that you have in your app code. And one of them might be the SSRF. But the developer, might miss it because it's a lot of noise at the end of the day. You might run another subsequent scan after that, and then let's imagine that you run an IEC scan at that point in time. And over here, you might find infrastructure misconfigurations. And the reality is none of these scans have at this point in time told you, do I have a breach? You still have a lot of noise, at least for the developer. And so if you were to have a capability to do breach path prediction and threat modeling, it can actually tell you that you have, when you stitch all of these events together or these scan results together, there is a full breach path that allows all the way from reconnaissance to actions on objective in your environment. And so that is actually step one. It's just telling your developers you have a serious problem. But looking at this, most people won't be able to figure out, how do I break this kill chain? So we have to make it really easy for developers to be able to break the kill chain. So in this example, something like a button that says fix breach path, as simple as that. And when they click on it, I'm actually going to take one step backwards. There is a misconfiguration here for IMDSV1, which we found. If we fix that misconfiguration, that could potentially break the breach path in this case. So when they click on the fix the breach path button, it would generate a merge request or a pull request that then fixes that one misconfiguration. So we actually generate the code to fix the merge request, to fix the misconfiguration. And the developer, all they have to do is click on approve and merge it back into their main branch, and they're done. So this is what I mean by we've got to help developers understand how to fix these issues, even though they're not security experts. So that was in dev time. In runtime, we have a similar situation where basically you might have a breach path that you detect in runtime. This is the example, the same breach path, but let's imagine that in runtime you're running a RASP tool, some sort of real-time application self-protection tool that detects app vulnerabilities. That tool will probably tell you you have an SSR vulnerability, but what it won't see is the infrastructure misconfigurations. And again, you could use an infrastructure monitoring tool to find the misconfigurations. Now, neither tool on its own can actually find this breach path. When you combine them, just like in dev time, you can find the same breach path in runtime. So if you're the security team and you're trying to you're monitoring your cloud environment, you could see something like this, where you can see this is the topology of my current environment. Here are the threats that are in my current environment, and this is mapped to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And this MITRE, then we take that framework and we map it to a kill chain. In this example, it's the Lockheed Martin kill chain, which tells you that yes, there is a full breach path from my environment that allows all the way from reconnaissance to actions on objective. And as a security person, you would simply press a button that says break the kill chain, which would generate the code and send it to the developer so that they can fix it. And it should be as easy as that versus having to manually create a ticket and follow up on it. So with that, I know we're out of time. I really apologize for the delay, but I hope this session was informative. I'm happy to chat with anybody who wants to talk about it. Each of these is a really broad topic, but if you're ever looking for me, definitely look me up on LinkedIn. I'd love to catch up and chat and kind of get your perspective. GitOps is definitely something new, and there's a lot of talk about it. So I'm curious to hear from you guys. What do you think of it? So anyway, thanks again. I hope you're having a great conference, and I had a great time, and I look forward to hopefully speaking to some of you guys offline. Thanks all.